Here's the contradiction that's tearing apart American foreign policy right now. The United States has built an entire geopolitical strategy around containing China's rise, while simultaneously depending on China so deeply that its actual collapse would trigger an American economic depression within months, not years. Months, and nobody in Washington wants to admit this openly. I'm going to show you the three interlocking systems that have created this paradox, systems that most analysts either ignore or fundamentally misunderstand. Because here's what the mainstream narrative gets wrong. They treat this like it's a simple rivalry, a new Cold War where one side wins and the other loses. But the US-China relationship isn't the US-Soviet relationship. It's something far more dangerous and far more intertwined. Let me give you the number that matters: $427 billion. That's not the trade deficit. That's how much China holds in active supply chain choke points for American critical industries. We're talking pharmaceuticals, rare earth elements, advanced electronics components, the stuff you can't just replace by reshoring to Ohio. So why does America need China to fail? And why would that failure destroy the very system America is trying to protect? The first system is what I call strategic obsolescence theater. Here's how it works. American geopolitical dominance since 1945 has rested on one foundation, being the indispensable economy. The dollar as reserve currency, the largest consumer market, the technology leader, the financial hub. Every other country needed access to America more than America needed them. That created leverage, that created power. China threatens to make that model obsolete, not by replacing it, but by creating an alternative gravity well. When countries can trade in yuan, clear payments through CIPSINs instead of SWIFT, access capital through the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank instead of the IMF, suddenly American leverage evaporates. Let me show you what this actually means on the ground. I was looking at data from Southeast Asian trade flows last month. In 2010, if you were Vietnam or Indonesia, 18% of your trade went to China, 12% to the US. By 2023, it's 32% China, 9% US. That's not just numbers, that's geopolitical gravity shifting in real time. Here's the uncomfortable part. If you're in the Pentagon or the State Department, you look at those numbers and you see American influence dying. Every percentage point of trade that shifts to China is leverage you lose. Every country that joins the Belt and Road Initiative is a country that might not vote with you at the UN, might not enforce your sanctions, might not pick your side when it matters. So the strategic imperative becomes clear. China's model has to fail. It has to be seen to fail, because if authoritarian state capitalism can deliver prosperity, if China can build influence through infrastructure instead of military bases, if the Beijing consensus can compete with the Washington consensus, then the entire post-1945 American-led order loses its ideological foundation. Most people think this is about Taiwan or the South China Sea. Those are symptoms. The real threat China poses to American power is proving that you don't need American-style democracy, American financial systems, or American approval to build a wealthy, technologically advanced society with global influence. That's what keeps strategists up at night. But here's the paradox, and this is where the second system comes into play. America has spent the last 30 years outsourcing the exact capabilities it would need to actually withstand a Chinese economic collapse. Think about it. What happens if China's economy actually does implode tomorrow? If the property sector contagion spreads, if youth unemployment spirals, if the whole debt-fueled growth model collapses the way Western economists have been predicting for 15 years, you might think America wins, right? China's threat disappears. Except here's what nobody tells you about global supply chains and just-in-time manufacturing. The second force at work operates completely differently, and it's the one that makes this entire containment strategy look like economic suicide. Stay with me, because what comes next reveals why American policymakers are trapped in a contradiction they can't escape. So here's the second force at work, and this one operates completely differently than the strategic theater we just discussed. I call it mutual destruction economics, and it's far more binding than any trade deal or diplomatic alliance. Let me give you the specific numbers that reveal how deep this goes. China manufactures 28.7% of global output. Not 28%, not about 30%, exactly 28.7% as of 2023. For context, the entire European Union manufactures 14.6%. The United States, 16.8%. But here's where it gets interesting. Those percentages don't tell you about choke points. A choke point isn't just we make a lot of this. A choke point is If this stops, entire industries collapse within weeks. China controls 80% of global rare earth refining, not mining, refining. You can dig neodymium out of the ground in California, but if you can't refine it into the form needed for electric vehicle motors or F-35 guidance systems, you have expensive dirt. The refining happens in Jiangxi province, in facilities that took 20 years and billions in subsidized losses to build. I talked to a supply chain manager for a major American electronics company last year. He told me something that stuck with me. We have 18-day inventory buffers for critical components from Shenzhen. If those shipments stop, our production lines go dark on day 19, and we're one of the prepared ones. 18 days. Here's what this actually means. If China's economy collapses, if their manufacturing base seizes up, if the financial contagion spreads to the point where factories start closing and ports stop operating efficiently, the American economy doesn't benefit. It hemorrhages, your iPhone production stops, not slows down, stops. There is no alternative production capacity at scale, not in Vietnam, not in India, not anywhere. Apple has spent years trying to diversify, and they've managed to move about 7% of iPhone production to India, 7%. After years of intensive effort and billions in investment, the pharmaceutical supply chain is even worse. The FDA estimates that 80% of active pharmaceutical ingredients in American medications come from China and India. But India's pharmaceutical industry, it sources 70% of its own ingredients from China. So really, we're talking about Chinese chemical production, feeding both Chinese and Indian drug manufacturing that then supplies American pharmacies. Here's the question nobody wants to answer. What happens to American hospitals when that pipeline breaks? This is the part that should terrify policymakers, and based on the strategic documents I've read, it does. The Pentagon released an assessment in 2021, mostly buried in technical language, that basically admitted the Department of Defense cannot sustain a prolonged conflict with China without Chinese manufactured components in its supply chain. Read that again. The military designed to potentially fight China can't function without Chinese supplies. That's not a rivalry, that's a mutual hostage situation. But it gets more complex because this isn't just about manufacturing. The financial entanglement runs just as deep. China holds approximately $816 billion in US Treasury securities as of late 2023. Now, everyone focuses on that number like it's a weapon China could use. What if they dump US debt? But that's not how this works. If you want to understand financial interdependence, just look at what happened in 2015. When China's stock market crashed and capital started fleeing, they had to sell about $300 billion in treasury holdings to defend the yuan. What happened? US bond yields barely moved. The market absorbed it because Japan bought more, because domestic demand increased, because the treasury market is $25 trillion deep. China's leverage isn't dumping treasuries. That would hurt them more than us. Their leverage is embedded in the real economy, in the factories and supply chains and manufacturing knowledge that can't be sanctioned or reshored on any timeline that matters for current political cycles. Let me show you where this creates the real contradiction. American politicians need to be tough on China. That's domestic politics 101 right now. But American CEOs need Chinese production to hit quarterly targets. American consumers need Chinese goods to keep inflation manageable. American hospitals need Chinese pharmaceutical ingredients to keep patients alive. So you get this bizarre performance, harsh rhetoric, symbolic tariffs, targeted sanctions on specific technologies while the actual economic integration continues and even deepens in areas outside the spotlight. And that brings us to the third system, the one that's actually driving decisions right now. And it's not what you think. The third system is what I call controlled decline management. And this is where American strategy gets really cynical, really calculated, and really dangerous. Here's what most analysts miss. The goal isn't actually to make China fail catastrophically. The goal is to slow China down just enough that American advantages can be rebuilt before the gap closes completely. It's not about winning, it's about buying time. Let me show you the numbers that matter here. China's GDP growth, 5.2% in 2023. America's 2.5%. Sounds like China's winning, right? But here's the deeper calculation happening in Washington. China's working age population peaked in 2015 and is now declining by about 5 million people per year. By 2035, China will have lost roughly 70 million working age adults. That's the entire population of France just gone from the labor force. Demographics are destiny in economics, and China's demographic collapse is locked in. It's not a possibility, it's already happening. The question is, does America's technological and financial advantage last long enough to still matter when China's growth inevitably slows? That's the real race. So the strategy becomes delay China's technological advancement in critical sectors, semiconductors especially, long enough that their demographic and debt problems start binding before they achieve self-sufficiency in the technologies that matter for military and economic power. A senior economist told me off the record last year, we don't need China to collapse, we just need them to stay dependent on us for chips while their population ages out. If we can hold the semiconductor choke point for another decade, the whole calculus changes. The CHIPS Act, the export controls on advanced lithography equipment, the restrictions on Nvidia selling high-end AI processors to China, these aren't preparations for conflict. They're preparations for managed competition where America retains specific technological choke points even as general manufacturing stays in China. Here's the uncomfortable truth that makes this strategy so risky. It assumes China just accepts this arrangement, that they don't retaliate in areas where they have choke points, that they don't accelerate their own semiconductor development, even if it's less efficient, that they don't decide the cost of breaking dependence is worth paying. And there's evidence they're doing exactly that. China's semiconductor imports dropped 15% in 2023, even as their tech sector grew. That's not demand destruction, that's substitution. They're using domestic chips even when they're a generation behind, paying the efficiency cost to build the industry. When I was reviewing trade data last month, that number jumped out. They're choosing strategic autonomy over economic optimization. Let me give you the specific timeline that worries me. SMIC, China's leading chip maker, is now producing 7-nanometer chips despite not having access to the most advanced Dutch lithography machines. They're doing it inefficiently with lower yields at higher cost, but they're doing it. The gap between cutting-edge American chips and capable Chinese chips is narrowing, not widening. Here's what this actually means. The window for the managed decline strategy is shorter than the policy assumes, maybe 5 years, maybe less, before China has domestically produced semiconductors that are good enough for most applications, not bleeding-edge AI training, but good enough for everything else. So what happens when that choke point disappears? This is where the paradox becomes a genuine crisis. If China achieves semiconductor self-sufficiency while America is still dependent on Chinese manufacturing for everything else, the leverage flips completely. China no longer needs to care about American export controls, but America still needs Chinese rare earths, Chinese batteries, Chinese solar panels, Chinese pharmaceutical ingredients. Most people think the semiconductor war is about stopping China. But here's what's really happening. It's about maintaining mutual dependence where America holds at least one critical card. Because complete Chinese self-sufficiency in a world where America remains dependent is the nightmare scenario for US strategists. Let me show you why this matters right now, today, not in some theoretical future. The Biden administration has approved more licenses for American companies to sell to Chinese firms than it has denied. The tough export control regime you hear about in headlines has exceptions, carve-outs and loopholes big enough to drive a truck through. Why? Because American semiconductor companies need Chinese revenue to fund the R&D that keeps them ahead. Nvidia makes billions from Chinese sales. Qualcomm, Intel, AMD, all of them have massive Chinese exposure. If you cut that off completely, you don't just hurt China, you defund the American innovation engine. You defund the American innovation engine that's supposed to maintain the technological edge this entire strategy depends on. That's the paradox at its sharpest point. Let me pull this together because this is where all three systems intersect to create what I call the interdependence trap. System 1, strategic obsolescence theater, means America needs China's model to be seen as failing to preserve ideological and geopolitical primacy. System 2, mutual destruction economics, means America can't actually afford a Chinese collapse without devastating its own economy. System 3, controlled decline management, means the strategy is to slow China just enough to rebuild American advantages, but that window is closing faster than the policy can adapt. Here's my opinion on where this goes, and it's not what either the hawks or the engagement advocates want to hear. We're headed toward the worst of both worlds. Increased tensions without actual decoupling, economic damage without strategic gain, and a progressive breakdown of the cooperative mechanisms that kept this rivalry stable. Let me give you 3 scenarios for how this plays out over the next decade. Scenario 1, managed divergence. This is the optimistic case. America successfully maintains semiconductor leadership and rebuilds critical supply chain redundancy in pharmaceuticals and rare earths. China's growth slows to 3% as demographics bite but remains stable. Both countries maintain economic ties in non-strategic sectors while competing intensely in technology and influence. Probability? Maybe 20%. It requires competent policy execution on both sides and no major crisis forcing rapid choices. Scenario 2, chaotic separation. A crisis Taiwan probably forces rapid decoupling before alternative supply chains exist. Both economies take severe damage. American inflation spikes as supply chains break. Chinese unemployment surges as export markets disappear. This is economically devastating for both, politically destabilizing, and potentially leads to the exact military conflict both sides want to avoid. Probability? I'd say 35%, and rising every year tensions remain this high. Scenario 3, Chinese breakthrough. China achieves technological self-sufficiency in semiconductors and other critical areas faster than expected, while America remains dependent on Chinese manufacturing. The leverage balance flips. America finds itself in managed decline, not managing China's decline. This is the scenario that terrifies Washington, but nobody talks about publicly. Probability, 45%, and here's why I think it's the most likely. China has one massive advantage in this race. They can command resources towards strategic priorities in ways democracies struggle to match. When China decides semiconductors are a national priority, they can throw $150 billion in subsidies at it without worrying about election cycles or return on investment timelines. They can force adoption of domestic chips even when they're inferior. They can accept short-term economic costs for long-term strategic gain. America's CHIPS Act is $52 billion spread over 5 years and already getting bogged down in permitting delays and political battles over where the factories get built. Here's my doubt, the question that keeps me uncertain. Can authoritarian state direction actually innovate at the cutting edge, or does it just catch up? China's great at adopting, adapting, and scaling, but genuine breakthrough innovation, the jury's still out. If that remains America's advantage, scenario 1 becomes more likely. If China proves that state-directed innovation can compete with market-driven innovation, scenario 3 is almost inevitable. My prediction: we'll know which scenario we're in by 2027. That's when China's stated timeline for Taiwan reunification readiness converges with the US election cycle and the trajectory of Chinese semiconductor development becomes clear. The decisions made in that window will determine whether this interdependence trap gets managed or collapses into something far more dangerous. Here's what you need to understand. This isn't a problem with a clean solution. Every option has massive costs. Complete decoupling means economic pain and inflation that could last years. Continued engagement means dependence on a strategic rival. Aggressive containment risks triggering the conflict it's meant to prevent. We're watching two countries that need each other to fail and succeed simultaneously. Locked in a rivalry, neither can fully win and neither can afford to lose. If you found this analysis valuable, subscribe because I'll be tracking exactly how this plays out. And leave a comment, which scenario do you think is most likely and what's the factor I'm missing that could change the calculus completely? The interdependence trap is tightening. The question is whether it breaks or evolves into something new.